This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you all for joining us, and thanks so much to Naoko Shimazu and the Comparative History series for making this possible today. I see some familiar faces in the audience, and I'm really glad that you were able to make it, and hope to talk to some of the others who I haven't met before afterwards and enjoy your questions and appreciate your input. As Naoko mentioned, this is going to be part of an article that recently came out, and also a small piece of a larger manuscript project that I'm working on right now. I want to spend the first 5 minutes or so just talking about the broader project as a whole, so you know why this little tiny slice fits into something bigger. And then I'm going to focus in on one part of the Philippine side of my project that I think is interesting and shows the kind of broader argument that I'm trying to make in the manuscript. So in extremely simple terms, basically what the entire manuscript project comes down to is really an observation. And that is that we have almost two separate historiographies about retributive violence after the Second World War. Globally speaking. You have a lot of scholarship written about a process of punishing war crimes, many of them newly invented or newly emerging set of international laws regarding what kinds of crimes of violence are to be permitted in war, and more importantly, a developing process for how to punish those crimes when they are proved to have taken place during the conflict. And then on the second, there is a very well-developed historiography about collaboration in wartime. In every country that's been occupied, whether it's by the Germans, the Italians, or the Japanese, you have usually a well-developed scholarship about people who helped the occupier, helped the Japanese in places like China, helped the Japanese in colonies like Korea, helped the Germans and the Italians in places ranging from Norway to Greece. So this observation about two separate historiographies has been something that's kind of puzzled me because, quite frankly, the actual things that those who are put on trial did in both cases are very often the same. In other words, those being put on trial for war crimes commit crimes of murder, of torture, massacre. Those being put on trial for collaboration are sometimes themselves guilty of torture, massacre, murder. Or, in the cases of higher-level collaborators, they are, in the words of war crimes trials, have command responsibility for security forces or police who are guilty for massacres, torture, murder. Nasty stuff, right? So, my question really is, what happens when you try the crimes of what is emerging as universal crimes against humanity within courts and in trials where the crime itself is described as treason? In other words, how do you punish brutality as betrayal? And so I wandered around, if you will, kind of like a historian traveler, through the various areas under Japanese control and asked that same question in each of these places. And today you're going to hear part of the answer to the Philippine question. Now, the answer is different in each place I go. There are patterns that I try to expand upon on the manuscript, but there are also significant differences, and you'll see that here in the Philippine case. The primary difference is that the Philippines, as of 1945, is still a colony of the United States. It gains its independence in 1946, at a time when the treason trials for those who helped the Japanese during its occupation of the Philippines from late 1941 to the summer of 1945. It puts them on trial beginning already in 1945 and then after its independence in 1946. And that's basically the background for the overall project. So let me go into a little more detail. And I apologize for those of you who are already quite familiar with the Philippine case, but I think it's important to get some background. And then you'll see where I'm going to zoom in and give you one example of the unusual effect of punishing brutality as betrayal. The Japanese invade the Philippines in late 1941, in December, and they very quickly do something that they didn't always do in some of the other areas under their control. They decide to immediately embrace the local elites of Filipino society. They set up a commission with pretty much as many of the pre-war elites as they can get a hold of, and you have a new independent Philippine Republic eventually declared in 1943, and this continues down to the end of the war. At the time of Japanese surrender, there is still fighting going on in the northern Philippines. So when we talk about who are the collaborators in the Philippines, there are a range of people that are portrayed as such from the Philippine perspective, the Philippine nationalist narrative perspective. We have officials and local elites who worked for this Philippine Executive Commission and later served the Philippine Republic that gains its nominal independence in 1943. And then others among the accused in treason trials just after World War II are closer to the bottom of the power hierarchy. But they're the ones who are confronted and participated in the daily violence of the Japanese occupation at close proximity. They serve as auxiliaries, as soldiers, as informants, in police, in the constabulary units. And by an accident of birth, and under the laws and rhetorics of treason, they are punished for their violence rather than for war crimes that are happening at the same time in the Philippines for Japanese soldiers. If the war crimes trials of the Japanese in the early post-war period fell short in many ways, I'm going to argue here today that punishing the brutality of war carried out by the Filipinos as betrayal results in other kinds of problems that are both legal and from a longer perspective, more historiographical. The acts committed by the Filipinos are justified by themselves as acts of sacrifice carried out in the defense of an Asian order, a Japanese-led Pan-Asian order. They also saw themselves as the only bulwark against the injustices of Western imperialism and specifically the return of the American colonizer. When the Philippines returned to American control and was granted independence again in 1946, these same acts are denounced as examples of barbarity that breached universal laws as they are now described in the aftermath of World War II. In Philippine courts that tried them, it was more important to demonstrate their disloyalty and their betrayal than to establish the scale and the nature of their specific acts of brutality. And the pre-law war of treason that they were tried on in the Philippine case actually defines their betrayal as not against one, but two different nation states. A Philippine Commonwealth that technically no longer exists at the time that these treason trials finally reached the courts, and the United States, the very colonial power that the new Philippine Republic has been struggling to establish its independence from. Now, the 1940s was a decade that saw many claims of liberation and independence in the Philippines. On the eve of the Japanese invasion of the archipelago in December of 1941, the Philippines was an American colony that exercised already limited autonomy under its Commonwealth President, Manuel Quezon. Philippines had been promised full independence by 1946 under the terms of the 1934 Tidings-McDuffie Act, but the arriving Japanese declared themselves agents of liberation, come to help the Filipinos cast off Western imperialism. As I said, they worked with pre-occupation elites, and under the later nominally independent Philippine Republic, these occupation authorities faced increasing resistance from a variety of US-supported as well as independent guerrilla forces. Many of these groups radically increased the scale of their raids and the harassment of Japanese occupation forces after the return of US forces to Philippine soil in 1944. So the images that are associated with the historical, the brutality that's associated with the Japanese occupation, in large part comes from these final months, from 1944 to 1945, as the Japanese control over the Philippines breaks down. That's not to say that there wasn't massive acts of atrocity prior to that time. It's just that a lot of the organizations and the individuals who will later face trial, the individual acts of violence that they committed happened from this point in 1944 on. Now, the violence of the occupation itself is most memorably associated with the horrifying fate of the surrendered Philippine and American soldiers in the Bataan Death March, but this is from an earlier period. This is from 1942. And then the increasingly brutal counterinsurgency campaign of Japanese military and its allies. especially the atrocities of the Japanese forces in Manila in February of 1945. The war crimes associated with all of these atrocities would be the subjects of trials of Japanese soldiers and officers after the war, carried out both by American military courts and later by Philippine war crimes trials run by the new Philippine Republic. The collaboration of the Filipinos with Japanese occupation was handled separately. Formal investigations of those accused of treason against the United States and the Philippine Commonwealth were carried out by the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, which follows the American soldiers as they're moving into the Philippines. And the files by the Counterintelligence Corps are used in the treason trials that take place in the aftermath of the war. Beginning with the People's Court, this Philippine People's Court that's set up in September of 1945. In accounting for and justifying the leniency of what results, the People's Court is, in fact, tries a very small number of the total number of files on suspected collaborators collected by the Counterintelligence Corps. When historians look back on this process, the historical accounts have tended to emphasize the colonial status of the Philippines and have juxtaposed the collaboration with the Japanese alongside the long-standing collaboration by Filipinos with the United States. In political debates and during the trials that followed the Japanese defeat, however, this debate was not, unlike the historiography now, it was rarely framed in these post-colonial terms. Instead, the wartime leaders of the Philippines leaned heavily upon the same two arguments that local allies of military occupations employed everywhere around the world in their trials after the Second World War, from France to China. They used two standard arguments. It's the shield defense, which claims that the collaborators mitigated the violence of the occupier, and the double game defense, which is the argument that patriotic collaborators feigned allegiance to the occupier while secretly supplying aid to the resistance. This is absolutely standard. You hear it in France, you hear it in China, whether it's Wang Jingwei or it's Pétain in France, right? It's everywhere you go, you hear these same two kinds of arguments. Now, how persuasive these two arguments are in societies today varies widely from country to country. Okay, these approaches achieved unparalleled success in the special Philippine People's Courts for crimes of treason committed during the occupation set up in September 45, especially when combined with a compromised judiciary and weak support from the early post-war government. The crippled process is usually described as ending with a presidential amnesty signed by President Roxas at Proclamation Number 51 on January 28, 1948. So from 45 to 48, there is a process of treason trials. It ends with an amnesty declaration by the president. And historians of the treason trials in the Philippines mostly focus on these 3 years and the relative leniency of the process. My story today is about what happens after 48. The amnesty provided official validation of the shield defense, arguing that wartime collaborators believed in the necessity of their wartime roles. In the words of the amnesty itself, it was their patriotic duty to execute their leadership roles in the interests of the safety and well-being of their countrymen who were at the mercy of the enemy. And they, open quote, did everything in their power to minimize the atrocities of the enemy, close quote. The amnesty was not universal, however. It was declared that public sentiment favoring mercy, quote, did not extend to persons who voluntarily took up arms against the alleged nations or the members of the resistance forces, or acted as spies or informers for the enemy, or committed murder, arson, coercion, robbery, physical injuries, or any other crime defined and punished by our penal laws, close quote. Anyone accused of these crimes would continue to face charges of treason, together with other crimes of violence, even after the dismantlement of the People's Court system. When the Philippine legislature debated the presidential amnesty in February of 1948, it was this contrast between the collaboration of the occupation's governing elite and the informers and military collaborators that dominated the discussion. Was it fair, critics asked, to punish thousands of largely poor and lower-level collaborators who were at the site of the massacres, while exempting everyone higher up in the wartime apparatus? The legislature eventually ratified the amnesty by a large majority, but the trials of those who remained after the amnesty would reveal the challenges of punishing atrocities, and since that's pretty much what was left, and wartime violence through trials dominated by the charge of treason. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on the forms of military collaboration in the Philippines, but to make it simple, there are two major armed groups that are supporting the Japanese. There's been some great work by Japanese scholars that looked at the far greater variety of organizations that assisted the Japanese, but the two most important ones are the Philippine Constabulary, or the Bureau of Constabulary, as it's renamed during the occupation, and a second organization that is most infamous and most well-remembered in historical memory in the Philippines, known as the Makapili. This organization, the Makapili, was short-lived. It's founded in 1944. In Japanese, it's known as the Philippine Aikokudo Shikai. And it lasted only until the collapse of the Japanese in 1945. But from a Philippine kind of memory perspective, it's the Makapili who are associated with the atrocities of collaborators during the occupation. And especially they are associated with one particular powerful image, the so-called magic eye. These were informers who wore these palm leaf baskets over their heads with a little slit for their eye. Something that we discussed earlier today is also a prominent image in memories of the massacres of Chinese in Singapore as well. And these masked individuals were used in identity parades. They would point out suspected guerrillas, which were then often killed by Japanese, especially in rural areas of the Philippines. So these are the two primary organizations that are involved in actually helping the Japanese carry out their counterinsurgency campaigns, primarily in rural areas throughout the Philippines, and reaching its height of violence in 1944 to 1945. All right, well, let me jump now to the actual trials after the amnesty of 1948. The vast majority of accused Filipino traitors were dismissed. Their trials were dismissed for lack of evidence or other technicalities, even before the 1948 February amnesty and the dismantlement of the People's Court. Of the cases that remained, some convictions were appealed to the Philippine Supreme Court, and that's the primary base of sources that I've been using, is looking at these Supreme Court rulings, which includes a lot of case materials on some of the more violent cases. The rulings of at least 157 cases are readily accessible in numerous Supreme Court digests and legal databases. But this small number of cases cannot come close to the scale of violence that civilians faced at the hands of these Filipino auxiliaries, or for that matter on resistance forces, but they were pardoned in another way. Historians of the treason trial process, there's two primary works on this, one by Augusto Viana and David Steinberg. They claim that less than 1% of People's Court treason cases were tried and reached conviction before the amnesty. But it's not known how many of the remaining untried cases were turned over to regular criminal courts, where they end up after the People's Court is dismantled. This 156 convictions that reached the Supreme Court that I looked at is extremely close to the number, the 156 convictions is extremely close to the number of Supreme Court rulings that I was able to track down, in fact 157. But it's less than half the number of those who eventually receive a pardon in 1953. So there's a lot of cases floating out there that I haven't been able to trace. And what you're looking at is basically half of the final list of those who were pardoned. Now, these are pretty small numbers, but I want to argue that they're representative of something that's broader. The majority of these post-amnesty treason cases in the Philippines are happening at a time, they're going through these regular criminal courts between 48 and 53 during one of the most violent times in Philippine 20th century history, besides the Japanese occupation. They continued through an increasingly violent insurgency known as the Huck Rebellion, through elections plagued by corruption and the conclusion of the Philippine war crimes trials against the Japanese, which ends in 1949. They continued through the suspension of habeas corpus under presidential emergency powers in 1950, through the sudden and controversial execution of over half a dozen Japanese war criminals in 1951, the rural reconstruction movement of 1952, and the dramatic suppression of the Huk insurgents under the then Secretary of National Defense, Ramon Magsaysay, who was later president. This is a period in which you have an insurgency that's being crushed again by a Philippine regime, and this time there's plenty of executions, summary executions, atrocities being committed both by the insurgents and by the state. And these wartime cases kind of travel quietly through the courts, while this other group of insurgents out in the same rural areas where the atrocities had happened under the war are taking place in an extra-legal environment, the same extra-legal environment that existed under Japanese occupation. Well over half of the treason cases ruled by the Philippine Supreme Court, some 92 in total, involved an accused member of the occupation period Bureau of Constabulary, or was an alleged member of the organization known as the Makapili, or were attached to the Japanese military police, or they were a so-called United Nippon, which is actually not the real title, but that's what they were referred to in court documents, auxiliary member, or a member of the Coastal Defense Corps. For years after the defeat of Japan, the Supreme Court that makes these rulings is a rather awkward institution to deliberate on the issue of collaboration. 5 of its 11 early post-war members had served in the occupation government in some capacity, and 3 of its members had served on the wartime Supreme Court itself under Japanese occupation. So here we have Supreme Court judges trying collaboration cases when they were Supreme Court judges on behalf of the Japanese. To be fair, I've looked at their wartime rulings, and most of them are civil cases and of relative not that interesting. So it's not as if they're necessarily ruling on cases that would involve eventual execution of those resisting the Japanese, for example. As we examine their handling of cases involving wartime atrocities, however, it's important to note that the slow-moving legal machine works side by side of this other legal and extra-legal process of punishing political dissidents in the Philippines at the time. At the same time the Supreme Court is handing down its rulings, this new rebellion by the Hukbalhap that's brewing in the plains of Luzon is going on, and summary justice in the field is happening on a scale, and in sometimes using similar techniques with the Japanese themselves. So it's not terribly surprising that these post-48 trials that I'm looking at have not been considered much by historians. But the Philippine Supreme Court's treatment of murder, wartime murder, as treason, and denying sexual crimes in war their political nature, I think capture the legal and political field of moral calculation regarding wartime atrocities in the early post-war period that I argue throughout my manuscript is true of a lot of other areas of East and Southeast Asia. Now, in my article, in my manuscript, I have a number of different cases where I examine that show the way in which the particular legal environment of the Philippines means that strange things happen when you try violence as treason. Perhaps the most important one for today is the fact that most of these trials that go to the courts involve a charge of treason together with a separate charge of, say, murder or torture or robbery or arson or something. And they're called a complex crime. And the combination of these two charges can then compound this, they can work together to create a more serious sentencing, and they change the process of the trial itself. At the same time, this charge of complex crimes is used against political dissidents in the Philippines throughout the post-war period to make sure that someone who's guilty of attempted murder or a crime of violence against a police officer, say, for example, can have treason or another political crime slapped onto it in order to make the sentencing much longer, and thus make it easier to lock up political dissidents for long periods of time, for example. Now, interestingly, in the Philippine case, with those who were collaborating with the Japanese military during the war, the Supreme Court rules very early on that no, these are not complex crimes. It's not treason plus murder when a makapili or a Bureau of Constabulary officer goes into a village and kills someone in that village. The murder is their treason. The arson is their treason. The act of violence is the manifestation of the betrayal. So it's not two separate crimes. The violence is the act of treason. Now, that's true in some European cases. It's true in Chinese treason law, for example. But in the Philippines, due to the way that they inherited the American legal system, it has very real consequences on the ground. And I'll just name 3 consequences. When you get rid of this possibility of trying someone for a complex crime of treason plus murder, say, for example, then it has an impact on the requirements for evidence, at least in the case of an American treason law. Because under American treason law, you have to have 2 witnesses for every act of treason. This was something built into the American treason law to make it harder to punish somebody for betraying the state. But when you're punishing cases of murder and violence in the wartime period, if you have to have 2 witnesses for every act of atrocity, that makes it pretty hard to punish wartime atrocities, right? A second impact it has is on the requirements for motive. The treason law is worded in such a way that you can't be guilty of treason. If I kill Owen up here in the front row, if I just kill Owen, it's not treason, but I have to kill Owen on behalf of Japan for it to be a treason crime, for example. So this means it shifts the emphasis of the trial from the act of violence itself to why I committed that violence. Did I do it on behalf to provide aid and comfort to the enemy? And then finally, it has an impact on sentencing. It changes the way that death sentences, for example, can be given out to those guilty of violence. Now, you may be asking yourself, who cares? As long as the people who committed all these horrible acts are going to trial and getting punished for it, why does it matter? Well, I mean, we already saw one case where it's actually problematic because it makes it harder to punish some of those who are guilty of acts of violence. But today, I'm just going to focus on one specific other case where it creates a certain strangeness, and that's in the case of sexual violence and punishing sexual violence in the case of the Japanese occupation. So this is something I call the crime political in nature, taking it from a quote from the Supreme Court judge, which I'll come to in just a second. Thanks to the Philippine policy of complex crimes, a collaborator's violent acts, including beatings, torture, and the massacre of civilians, very cheery topic today, don't you agree? Beatings, torture, and the massacre of civilians was not considered separate crimes or even special complex crimes. But in the cases of rape or the abduction of women into sexual slavery, however, majority rulings in the Philippine Supreme Court held that neither acts constituted aid and comfort to the enemy. Again, you might say, why does it matter? As long as those who committed rape or attempted rape are punished, why does it matter? And we'll see that in a second. Instead, they were seen as aggravated circumstances. Sexual violence was a prominent feature of the Japanese military conquest throughout East and Southeast Asia, and with some variation, such as the opening stages of the occupation of the Dutch East Indies, for example, when the Japanese command demonstrated some ability to limit its attacks on women. By contrast, the occurrence of rape by Japanese soldiers in the Philippines from the earliest stages of the occupation was enough to cause alarm even amongst Japanese military officers. Section chiefs of the Japanese Ministry of War in February of 1942 saw the 14 rapes that had reached their desk as a considerable number. Although this obviously came nowhere near the prevalence of rape being experienced by Filipinos out there, at least according to numerous testimonies that have been collected by, among others, Japanese historians who have done oral histories in this regard. While a constant part of the campaign of violence and fear in the counterinsurgency campaign against guerrillas throughout the archipelago, the widespread rapes that happened during the battle for Manila in February of 1945 were actually among the many war crimes during the military tribunal of General Yamashita Tomoyuki, whose troops held the city later in the fall of the same year, which resulted in his conviction and execution. So among his war crimes were some of the only, I mean there are some in the European cases as well, but his trial is actually some of the only indictments of rape as part of war crimes trials after World War II. Attempts to reduce the spread of venereal disease and arbitrary acts of sexual violence led, as I think most of you know, to the formation of military brothels. According to 1943 count, over 1,000 Filipino women employed by deception or various degrees of coercion including many Filipinas directly abducted by Japanese troops, served in these official comfort stations, while many more were taken and held as sex slaves by small isolated army units. None of the Japanese soldiers or civilians were tried for the operation of the Comfort Women Station, the Comfort Women system in the Philippines, but the indictments of Japanese soldiers and civilians for war crimes trials carried out by Filipino courts did include 45 counts of rape, the third largest category of war crimes behind the abuse of civilians, 92 counts, and the killing of civilians, 134 counts. So how did the Supreme Court of the Philippines deal with cases of these kinds of atrocities when Filipino collaborators were the perpetrators, or indirectly complicit in the broader Japanese system of sex slavery? An example to this approach to sexual violence can be seen in the 1949 ruling on 14 counts of treason in the case of a Filipino agent of the Japanese military police, Antonio Racaza. Rape was seen only as an aggravating circumstance and not an overt act of treason, a finding that would set a precedent for other rulings later in the treason trials that I've looked at. His other violent acts, in which he, quote, willfully, unlawfully, feloniously, and treasonably, in the words of the indictment, close quote, summarily shot, beheaded, strangled suspected guerrillas, tortured detainees, guided Japanese soldiers on raids. These acts constituted the very acts of his treason. But his attempt to rape a woman who refused to offer information during a raid was explicitly reduced to aggravating circumstances, which were seen as, quote, deliberately augmenting unnecessary wrongs, close quote, without itself constituting an overt act of treason. Now, in a separate opinion issued on behalf of the majority, Associate Justice Gregorio Perfecto concurred with the conviction, but argued that the attempted rape should not even be considered as an aggravating circumstance. And why? He says, the attempted rape on the person of, and this is the name of this one individual, may be considered as grounds for the prosecution of a difference offense. In other words, this has got nothing to do with treason. Have a separate rape trial, if you like. But it cannot be considered as aggravating treason, which is a crime political in nature. In the attempted rape, there was nothing political, and it had nothing to do with the defendant's adherence and aid to the enemy. Now, this might strike us as common sense now, but keep in mind that at this moment in time, the acts of violence other than sexual violence are all being interpreted as the very manifestation of one's betrayal of the nation. Justice Perfecto was here trying to make a distinction between common crimes and the uniquely political crime that was treason. Sexual violence in war against a suspected guerrilla was not, he argued, like beatings, torture, and the killing of civilians, which constituted political crimes that provided aid and comfort to the enemy. Rape was thus neither treason nor a war crime, but alone among the acts of violence in this wartime context considered a common crime. If the court held that rapes did not themselves constitute acts of treasonous violence, then neither would the abduction of women into sexual slavery be considered acts of treason. The Filipino Supreme Court ruling in the case against another Filipino, Susano Kid Perez, his nickname was Kid, which would also become a precedent for similar cases I've seen, offers an unusually detailed justification for the position that complicity in securing sexual slaves for the occupation forces did not constitute acts of treason. It also offered a remarkable dissenting opinion, which revealed the glaring inconsistency in the court's argument. In all 6 counts of treason, Perez was accused of commandeering, quote unquote, women to serve as sexual slaves for Japanese officers and sometimes raping the women himself. In some cases, deception was used, such as when he summoned a woman for the purpose of, or purported purpose of providing testimony against some accused suspect, or when he attempted to convince a reluctant woman who had already escaped once that a Japanese colonel merely wanted to have her as his secretary. According to testimony in the trial, the same colonel would then go on to rape and enslave more than half a dozen women provided for him by Perez. In one of the counts, Perez took a woman he had delivered to a Japanese colonel directly from one rape encounter to an uninhabited house where he then raped the traumatized woman himself. On other cases, he abducted women from their homes and delivered them to banquets and dances where those who were selected were then subsequently raped by Japanese officers in attendance. Even nurses working in a nearby hospital were targeted for these invitations at gunpoint. Perez appealed his treason conviction and the death sentence that came with it, without denying any of the findings in these accounts. In his opposing brief, the Solicitor General argued that the actions of Perez constituted treason because his acts helped the Japanese to maintain and preserve the morale of the soldiers, close quote. The majority of the Supreme Court judges disagree. Their reasoning, I think, is worth quoting at length. Sorry for the long quote, but I think it's quite telling. The law of treason does not prescribe all kinds of social, business, and political intercourse between the belligerent occupants of an invaded country and its inhabitants. What aid and comfort constitute treason must depend on their nature, degree, and purpose. Sorry, did I just read that? As a general rule, to be treasonous, the extent of the aid and comfort given to the enemies must be to render assistance to them as enemies and not merely as individuals. And in addition, be directly in furtherance of the enemy's hostile designs. His, quote, commandeering, quote, of women to satisfy the lust of Japanese officers or men or to enliven the entertainment held in their honor was not treason, even though the women and the entertainment helped to make life more pleasant for the enemies and boost their spirit. He was not guilty any more than the women themselves would have been if they voluntarily and willingly had surrendered their bodies or organized the entertainment. Sexual and social relations with the Japanese did not directly or materially tend to improve their war efforts or to weaken the power of the United States. Whatever favorable effect of the defendant's collaboration with the Japanese might have had in the prosecution of the war was trivial, imperceptible, and unintentional. Intent of disloyalty is a vital ingredient in the crime of treason. The same argument employed by the court was also used, of course, to protect women who might have been accused for treason for their relationships with Japanese during the occupation, whether they were intimate or not, whether they served as secretaries or were involved in romantic relationships, and whether or not these were willing or involved some kind of element of coercion, although one could debate whether there's any examples of lack of coercion here. However, Perez, who freely admitted the accusations that he had violently coerced women, deceived them, and knowingly participated in the procurement of sexual slaves, would not receive any punishment for those acts, which were dismissed as trivial, imperceptible, and unintentional in their effect. The judges never fully confronted the fact that Perez was not simply procuring reluctant dance partners for the Japanese, but knowingly facilitating their rape. The death sentence and treason convictions were overturned to be replaced with a conviction on only 4 counts of rape for those acts of rape that he carried out himself, and a 10 to 17-year sentence for those encounters that involved murder and other acts of overt violence. Associate Justice Guillermo Pablo, who had served as a judge in Cebu before the war, was among one of the few Supreme Court judges at the time that had not served on it during the occupation, and he offered the lone dissenting voice in the Supreme Court ruling on this case. He quoted from the Solicitor General's brief a rather uncomfortable comparison between the role of the United Services Organization in providing entertainment to the U.S. Army in Philippines and the, quote, entertainment, close quote, provided by the Japanese imperial forces. It appeared incomprehensible to him how the provision of women for the enemy could not be seen as an example of aid and comfort for the enemy. He did not dance around the issue of rape of women who testified, and he did not speak only in vague terms of entertainment. However, by conceding its political nature, Pablo shifts the focus from the women who were the victims of the violence that we would today clearly identify as war crimes, to see them and argue that these crimes of rape and sexual slavery were an affront to the nation itself. He asked rhetorically in his dissenting opinion whether there could be any greater treason than such acts. Quote, "They took over all of our resource production, everything in their path, but by God save the honor of our women," close quote. This is in his dissenting opinion. The fact that these sexual crimes of war were treated differently in the treason trials than other crimes is a reminder that legal systems around the world, as of the late 1940s, including this early post-war Philippines, had yet to grapple fully with the relationship between acts of sexual violence and the environment of war. In these early post-war trials, the comfort system of sexual enslavement, which involved thousands of women throughout Japanese occupied areas, received the dedication of a court only in one case, and this is the 1948 Batavia Military Tribunal, which tries Japanese for the rape and forced prostitution of one particular group of Dutch women. Forced prostitution was a prosecutable crime along with rape, and did find some mention in other war crimes trials taking place in the late 1940s. But it's often buried in the testimony that covered a wide range of other atrocities, such as the descriptions of abduction of women into sexual slavery for German officers in Smolensk and in a nearby village of Basmanova. Mention of the high incidence of rape also appears in the testimony of war crimes trials in Tokyo and elsewhere, especially in relation to the atrocities in Nanjing after its capture in December 1937. However, overall, after World War II, sexual assaults were given far less direct attention in terms of actual prosecutions. The Philippine Supreme Court was, in all treason cases, not evaluating the issue in terms of international laws of war, but in a domestic legal context, in which the sole choice was between the common crime of rape and the capital crime of treason. Rejecting the political nature of the crimes did not remove the possibility of punishing those same sexual crimes, but it was a telling exception, given that its other rulings held that all forms of violence in the service of the occupier was treasonous, was an example of betrayal of the nation. As the dissenting opinion of Justice Pablo suggests, nationalizing the crime of rape by including it as a form of treason would not necessarily have brought Philippine society any closer to confronting the issues of rape and sexual enslavement as weapons of war and expressions of occupation power. Instead of focusing on the women who survived the sexual violence, punishment for their enslavement in the form of a treason charge could easily transform the issue into a consideration of its violation of the nation's honor. It would not be until the wars of Yugoslavia in the 1990s that the full range of these issues would begin to receive considerable attention from the academic, legal, and social realms. Okay, I don't want to go into too much more detail about the rest of the trials, but I just want to conclude by saying a little bit about how these trials end. They continue through until 1953, and then as part of a larger package of pardons, done partly out of a concern over Japanese-Filipino relations at the time, the remaining Japanese war criminals that are being held by the Philippine government are pardoned. But almost twice as many Filipino traitors are then released at the same time. I found very little information about the actual fate of these individuals afterwards, but in one very interesting account by William Pomeroy, who's an American communist in the Philippines at the time, he's in the prison at the moment when these pardoned traitors are on their way out of the prison. I don't know how to pronounce this, but he hears all of the prisoners in the prison yelling, "Takshil, takshil," or does anyone know how to pronounce that correctly? "Traitor, traitor." And he writes, "There was more respect for the thief and the murderer here than for the traitor." I mean, it's clear that the powerful emotion behind the anger of the acts of betrayal are something that's a long legacy, that not just here in the Philippines, but we see it elsewhere as well. When the 1948 amnesty argued that public sentiment did not extend to those waging war in the Philippines and carried out atrocities against the people, it set aside some acts of violence as fundamentally different in nature. It did this in a fashion that's not entirely dissimilar from the way that war crimes trials around the world after World War II struggled to create and foster an understanding of a universally prohibited realm of violence. But the trials for treasonous atrocities and war crimes differed in two fundamental ways. The retributive process created this space, or attempted to create this space, at the conclusion of a process of elimination. They basically carved out all of these other acts of betrayal, and then what was left over, still treason, but still put on trial in regular criminal courts. Rather than as a part of a process to confront directly the incredible violence, the scale of violence that had occurred in the Philippines. I'm not saying that we should expect in the 21st century it to have been any different, but I think that observation can help us understand the relationship between an emerging divergence in the way that violence in war is treated. In other words, the violence would remain submerged, and indeed in much of the historiography today about retribution against collaboration, it continues to remain submerged below a dominant narrative about this within the issue of betrayal and treason, rather than thinking about it in the universalistic terms that the separate debates over the value, the failure, success of the growth of international humanitarian law after World War II. And secondly, and this is my final point, the violence at the heart of the charges was, as we've seen, ever clouded by, the primary crime that they're judged for, a violation of allegiance to the nation. This is a global phenomenon. It's not just something that happened in the Philippines. I saw it in my examination of the Burmese case, the Red Fort trial, treason trials in India, in Chinese trials both on the side of the nationalists and in communist-controlled areas of Shandong province, which I've looked at, and in an interesting but slightly different way in the post-war Korean example as well. I've only given you one slice and one very specific look at it. This is the only place where I've taken a closer look at the aspect of treason and sexual crimes in war, but it was one where the sources came through in a particularly interesting way. So I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much for listening.